to this week's episode of the Cleveland, Ukraine podcast. I'm your host, Nate Darling. Inspired by the bravery and perseverance of Ukrainians in the face of a relentless enemy, I'm on a mission to show the world that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people have a bright future that is more than war. In partnership with the Cleveland Maidan Association and the Ukrainian Museum Archives, we delve into the rich history of the Cleveland Ukrainian population, feature local Ukrainian community leaders and friends of Ukraine, and immortalize the stories of those united in their fight to preserve Ukraine's democracy and sovereignty as they join the world stage. Good morning and welcome to the Cleveland Ukraine podcast. Today we host Dr. Doug Davis. Dr. Davis works in the Level 1 Trauma Center at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He is Ukrainian by marriage and serves on many boards and NGOs that are often U.S. veteran-led and have a medical focus. Doug is an ardent supporter of Ukraine and consistently volunteers his time at a number of organizations as well by bringing his own expertise. Dr. Davis, how are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you for having me on today.
Well, good. We're happy to have you here as well. I've got a lot of questions. You've been busy. I read thoroughly over your LinkedIn. You've done a lot of great work. I've got a lot of great questions as well. But before we get too much further into it, we always like to start with understanding, where people grew up, what their backgrounds were. Have you always been in Wisconsin? Where'd you grow up?
No, I like to say I'm Texas's cultural ambassador to the world, currently serving my post in Wisconsin. So I was born and raised. There you go. I was born and raised in Texas. Left Texas at the end of college to go to medical school in Connecticut. So, but born and raised Texan, and grew up in what you've already made some allusions to, the history backgrounds and stuff like that. But my family had I guess the best way to describe it was a Cold War warrior family. My dad was in the Air Force. My brother and I were both on trajectories for military careers. Actually, I ended up in medicine kind of as a strange detour.
Sure.
But yeah, my roots are Texan, so.
That's awesome. We have the amount of episodes that I've talked about Ukrainians or Texas just in some relation. I think 3 or 4 episodes now we've talked about the either people that came from Texas or Ukrainians that were visiting Texas as well. So it's always super funny to me to see kind of like the Ukrainian perspective both on America and Texas specifically. I'm sure you live this every single day, but it's a whole different world out there, right?
Well, when my wife and I are, meeting a new crowd, I'm introducing my wife to somebody, I was like, my wife is from another country, Ukraine. I too am from a whole other country called Texas. And
I agree.
She have a lot of similarities. I mean, actually, geographically, Texas is about the same geographic size as Ukraine, and actually, even sort of the fierce Texas spirit is very similar to a lot of what you describe about Ukraine. So we say that my wife and I both come from different countries, but very similar ones.
Well, Dr. Davis, you'll have to listen to the Sasha Bull episode if you haven't, because that's all about Ukrainian country music, and he spent a lot of time in Texas. So. The parallels are only getting deeper. So, Dr. Davis, let's get a little bit more into what inspired you to the medical field. I have to imagine everybody has a different calling to that. What was your calling to that?
I had actually been on a trajectory I had enlisted in the Navy as a delayed entry program, and when I was in high school, and was planning on going to the U.S. Naval Academy. But at the same time, I was doing biomedical research at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio, and had a really amazing mentor there, Dr. Richard Albanese. He was an MD PhD, and this was in the mid '90s, where the U.S. was undergoing a lot of scale back in its military because we'd won the Cold War. It was the Soviet bloc had fallen apart, and so some of the things that I was thinking I was going to do for my military career kind of shifted, and I was working with this mentor who said, "Hey, you've got medical talent and research talent. You should maybe consider that." So and my mom had been an ICU nurse, so I was, growing up being very familiar or exposed to the medical world. So I made a pivot right at the end of high school and decided to go pre-med, and ended up saying, because I had focused all my energy and efforts on ROTC scholarships and stuff like that, and the advice I'd gotten was like, if you want to go medicine and you want to do research, the military might limit your options because they'll dictate, which pathway you go. So I kind of scrambled and had missed a lot of scholarship deadlines, and then just ended up being like, okay, I'll go to my dad's school, because my dad, after he had gotten out of, he spent the last part of his career as a professor, and he was a professor at a small school in San Antonio, St. Mary's University. So it was easy for me to pivot there, and I was planning on probably just staying one semester a year and then trying to transfer out after I applied for scholarships elsewhere. But it ended up just being a fantastic place to go to school. I was doing research at the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio, which was just down the road, and actually ended up doing research programs in Virginia, at the University of Virginia, and then at Washington University. And actually, that's where I actually worked in a lab literally right across the hall from my wife's lab, because my wife went to Washington University. We didn't actually formally meet, but that when I was at WashU, but just a couple months after finishing that program before our senior year, we're sitting across the table at each other for indie PhD interviews at UT Southwestern, and that's where my wife and I met. So.
Well, I think that's a great story, Dr. Davis. So before you met your wife that is Ukrainian, what did you know about Ukraine? What was your relationship with it? Any thoughts around it?
Well, I'll frame the answer in terms of what I made what our first date was. So when my wife and I started dating, I was like, I said basically, listen, I'll date you, but you were a former Soviet, a former pioneer girl who sang songs to Grandfather Lenin. I need you to know where I'm coming from. So for our first date, I made her watch Red Dawn.
That's truly hilarious, and that's like that is the penultimate of America 80s propaganda, anti-Soviet propaganda.
Oh yeah, well, and interestingly, my family has a really close connection to that movie because the original Red Dawn, Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, C. Thomas Howell, Powers Booth, all those guys, was filmed the settings in the movie's Calumet, Colorado, but it was actually filmed in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And my best friend growing up, his grandmother has a ranch in Las Vegas where actually parts of that movie were filmed in and around her ranch. In fact, Patrick Swayze ended up buying a lot of the land. He loved the area so much after the movie. He ended up buying a lot of the land. I think his brother actually still lives there. So we had this like deep family connection. Plus, I grew up, my father was the Cold War warrior, mentality person. So it was interesting that because I had a lot of friends saying, "Whoa, you're dating a former." They would say a former Russian. I was like, no, she's not Russian. She's
like, this is a big distinction. Like wars are being fought over this question right now.
Oh my gosh, there's no faster way to incur my wife's wrath than saying, "Oh yeah, you're from Russia, right?" And
yeah,
so yeah, that was our sort of background, and it, coming together. It was interesting because I grew up thinking, that I was going to be a part of, the American, the good old patriotic Red Dawn style, we're standing up to the evil empire. And
no, I have to imagine between Red Dawn and Top Gun probably fulfill the military's recruitment needs for 4 years probably. So I think that's hilarious.
It is, yeah. Yeah, my brother my brother was even at briefly. He went to originally the Air Force Academy, left because he didn't he wasn't going to be an engineer, so there was not going to be no way for him to be a pilot. And so, but then he still though went on to a career in government work. So he's been, a U.S. Foreign Service officer, diplomat for 25 years probably now, all over the world. So there's a lot of, let's just say, there's always been a lot of geopolitics focus in our family going back, I feel like birth.
Yeah. Well, I have to imagine Thanksgiving was exciting always. So no, it's good. No, that's great. I think that's a fascinating story, and I'm just I have to imagine a little bit of the shock value to a Ukrainian now dating a Texan who's like family owned part of the set for Red Dawn, the most legendary anti-Soviet movie of all time almost. And so
Yep. It feels like there was some sort of destiny in there.
Little bit. No, that we'll get more into that here shortly. So, you went to medical school and now you work in a trauma center, and I have to imagine that attracts a certain breed for that kind of work. Let's talk about what do you think is necessary to be an effective trauma doctor? Because I have to imagine that's a totally different mindset.
Yeah. Well, so I'm a radiologist. My formal training is as a neuroradiologist, but the area of work I always had a passion for was emergency radiology. So I'm not a surgeon. I'm not an ER doc per se, but I'm the guy that's reading all the imaging and interfacing between the various doctor medical and surgical physicians who are dealing with everything from your appendicitis to our major trauma cases. So I started out really on an academic route, and then just really found my passion was for doing ER coverage. So my work is I only work nights basically, and covering the ER. So anything that's emergent, both for the inpatient hospitals we cover, but then also the emergency departments. And it's for me, it's where there's as a radiologist, a lot of radiology is outpatient work. So doing like my wife's a cancer doctor, and so her patients come in for cancer restagings. For me, that's not. I would say outpatient radiology for me was always felt soul crushing, because we have to count. Okay, did this little nodule get a tiny bit bigger or a tiny bit smaller or anything like that? Whereas in doing emergency radiology, you're really doing stuff that's making decisions about life and death that matters. So it is a high tempo and can be stressful, but it's also very rewarding.
Well, I have to imagine that you're seeing the immediate impact of your work, and stress management is definitely I'm sure a huge portion of that. So going back to Ukraine, how long have you been a supporter of Ukraine? I guess I would say a lot of that probably came from marrying your wife, but how long have you been involved with Ukraine in some kind of capacity?
Well, my first trip to Ukraine would have been around 2000, and it's, for me, I had this perspective having seen. I mean, that's 10 years after the Ukrainian independence, or almost 10 years after Ukrainian independence, and it was remarkable to me how on that first visit, it still felt very like what you would call Soviet-esque. You flew into the old Soviet airport in Lviv. It still had hammer and skull and all the Leninist iconography all over the airport. Got a little bit of a shakedown, during the first pass through customs there, and so every sort of caricature or stereotype you would have about a a Soviet country, there were features of that still very, very prominent. And then to see over the past 25 years or more, or 25 years, just how much Ukraine has changed, and it's just a remarkable night and day, the differences in it, and so it's why I kind of just roll my eyes when you hear people who've never been there and don't have any real understanding about, oh, Ukraine's just this corrupt country and stuff, and sure, there's definitely still problems and stuff, but to not have seen the trajectory and the change that's happened in Ukraine over 25 years, and to see how they've done it as a huge struggle because they've still been under the thumb of Russian influence throughout that time, and we were experienced it very personally as a family, because my wife and sister-in-law were both in Maidan during the original Orange Revolution when Yanukovych had tried to steal the election from Yushchenko after Yushchenko had been poisoned by probably Russian FSB, and my wife was there. I remember being very nervous about that because there was obviously concerns that what happened in the Revolution of Dignity, more than a decade later, or not quite a decade later, but would happen then, where it would turn violent. And I remember calling my wife, and back when the revolution or the Orange Revolution was happening, it wasn't as easy to contact people in Ukraine. You had to buy special calling cards. It wasn't.
Oh wow, yeah.
It wasn't like all the Zoom and Skypes and everything we take for granted now. And I remember getting a hold of her and somebody picking up the phone. I was like, "Who's this man answering my wife's phone?" Turns out it was my wife. She was so hoarse from yelling and singing in the Maidan that I didn't even recognize hers. But yeah, we've seen the evolution, from first visits just there in 2000 to my wife and her family being part of the Orange Revolution. We had tons of friends that were involved in Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, and then obviously moving forward through to the beginning, the true beginning of the war in 2014, but then the full-scale invasion in 2022. So our family's been there and been involved since the beginning. One of my wife's cousins, 25-year-old cousin, was one of the earliest casualties from the battle around Bakhmut in the first 6 months of the war. We've got friends and family that are on the fronts, going back to 2014. So it's and we were talking before we got on the podcast about the beginning. I like the way you said the beginning of World War III, but I like to say World War III actually didn't begin in Ukraine, and it didn't begin in 2022. It didn't even begin in 2014. It actually began on 9/11 in New York. But not the 9/11 everybody thinks about. If you look up New York Times, the article "A Plea for Caution" by Vladimir Putin is written on September 11th, 2013, and that's the day that I mark the beginning. Historians will go to and say, yeah, that's where Russia's strategic imperialism actually first took off. And it was where Russia got involved in Syria. And it's very interesting how here we are today, that coming full circle. And
very, very relevant on the timing, actually. I'm reading about this very morning, that almost overnight, after years and years of nothing, overnight, Syria capitulates.
Yeah, and it's the chickens coming home to roost. But September 11th, 2013, is actually when I started warning my wife's family. I was like, the war in Ukraine is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And sure enough, 4 months later, after Russia began its overt involvement in Syria to prop up Assad's regime, 4 months later, little green men are showing up in Crimea. And what was astounding to me then was that if you'll think back and remember, people actually, because Assad had crossed Obama's quote unquote red line and used chemical weapons on his people, which the United States had said would be their threshold to get involved. But it was coming on the heels of, the whole series of events in the Arab Spring, including, the death of the ambassador Stevens and 2 former Navy SEALs and their support staff in Benghazi. And so the U.S. really didn't have any more appetite or interest really for anything else in the Middle East. And everybody responded to Putin's article and offered to get involved in Syria with actually celebration. I was astounded by that because nobody paused and said, wait a minute, Vladimir Putin's not that great of a guy. He's not getting involved in Syria just to be a humanitarian. Nobody said what strategically, what is he thinking about? And it was obvious what he was thinking about. He was thinking about his strategic imperial interest, Tartus naval base, which is and the airfields near there, where Russia's able to project its strategic power and service its nuclear submarines in a warm water port. And that's why, to me, it was obvious where he's going next. He was going to Sevastopol to secure the warm water ports in Sevastopol. And that's why and what's really interesting, because now as the Black Sea Fleet has had to pull out because of the war, and now that the Russians are pulling out of Tartus, where are they going? They're going to the other part of this triad of critical warm water ports, Kaliningrad. They're pulling out the fleets from Tartus and sending them to Kaliningrad. So if anybody wants to know where the next stage of World War III is, it's the Silty Gap in Lithuania and Poland. That's where NATO has control of the landlocked Kaliningrad. So it was amazing to me that nobody even paused and questioned that at the time.
Yeah, we're definitely in very interesting times, and I know many people have said Vladimir Putin is not trying to rebuild the Soviet Union; he's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire, and it's a very important distinction. That this is not about we are all brotherly Slavic people. This is about the world knows one language, and that's power. And as you said, a lot of that is backfiring quite literally as we're recording this episode. So, Dr. Davis, let's pivot to some other things here as well. Give me kind of a rundown of all the organizations you are involved with right now, all the NGOs, what you're specifically doing. I wanted to hear it straight from you because I knew I'd get it wrong if I tried to list it all. But let's actually talk about the work you're doing right now.
I mean, it's probably easiest to go just kind of how, because it all just sort of, I mean, if somebody told me 3 years ago what my life would look like today, I would have said, you're insane. I can't remember my life before February, of 2022, because it's changed so much. But it really also started. We were very worried that, like a lot of people, that when I told my wife's family, be out of Ukraine before the end of the Beijing Olympics, because I was like, this war is going to happen, and it's going to go down just like it did in 2014 when as soon as the Sochi Olympics closed, Yanukovych had fled to Russia. It's like the invasion is going to start sometime immediately after the Beijing Olympics. Yeah. And all of our family in Ukraine said we were crazy and that no, nothing's going to happen. But we convinced my wife's family to at least send her parents and my nephews over. But we the bottom line was, we in the early phase were just trying to make sure our family was safe. Because we, like a lot of people, thought that the whole country would fall. And it's
Yeah.
3 years later, it's hard for people to remember just how scary those early days were and how uncertain they were. But as soon as we said sort of got it our senses about it and made sure our family was taken care of, we immediately pivoted to seeing what we could do to help. And my wife and I both being physicians, but here in the United States, and having a really extensive network across the U.S., but also having family that were, 3 generations of healthcare providers in Ukraine. We had pretty extensive networks there. Plus, with my family's background in the military and government, we had a good number of government contacts that could facilitate. We just started, let's see what we can do. And so the first thing we did was they just need tons and tons of material support. So we very quickly started working with a group called UMANA, Ukrainian Medical Association North America. The president of UMANA was a radiology colleague of mine from Connecticut, who I just cold called after I'd not talked to him for like 5 or 6 years, and I was like, "Hey, Dr. Leo Walensky, this is Doug Davis. We want to get involved in sending medical material aid to Ukraine." He's like, "Wait a minute, Doug Davis?" He's like, "You're Ukrainian?" I was like, "Davis doesn't sound Ukrainian." I was like, "Well, Ukrainian by marriage." Like, we'd known each other for years, but I didn't actually realize he was Ukrainian. He didn't obviously realize I was married to a Ukrainian, but that's where we started. And I ended up running a warehouse in a 40,000 square foot warehouse in Milwaukee. The Rotary Club of Milwaukee became this backbone of our volunteer support, where we probably had close to 1,000 volunteers on our list, or at least several hundred, that would help us with actually collecting material aid from across the country. I at one point in time had probably 200 to 400 pallets, and we had to basically get that set up and sorted and packaged so it could be sent over. And we were originally sending it over by air cargo, but then that got too expensive and wasn't being donated, so we pivoted to maritime cargo transport. And so the first year was a lot of just trying to mobilize material aid, and that just began to build out and grow. And so that was UMANA and Rotary. But at the same time, as we're trying to send the material aid, we needed partners on the Ukraine side who could accept it and get it distributed. And there was a lot of concerns about corruption and things people were hesitating on donating because they're like, well, how do we know it's not just going to end up on the black market? And so very early on, I was supposed to be traveling to Ukraine in the first month of the war, like in March, basically to just give confidence to our donors that, look, I'm here with our partner warehouse in Ukraine. It can verify the bona fides of our partners, that the chain of custody is solid, and that there shouldn't be any concerns about that. But we obviously had real concerns about safety and security. There were Russians. There was actually, people don't remember this, but the first 6 months of the war, there were still a lot of Russian FSB and or sympathizers throughout Ukraine, and Ukraine was spending a lot of time just rooting those folks out. There had been medical workers that had been targeted and killed. We knew for a fact that the Russians were monitoring cell phone towers for any non-Ukrainian numbers, and it's passive. It's a passive monitoring because your cell phone's constantly pinging cell phone counter, and the Russians were, and you can't encrypt that, so the Russians were just monitoring it, and they would actually automatically up a site to a missile targeting priority if there were more than one non-Ukrainian number country codes pinging cell phone towers. So we knew about things like that going on, and I was trying to decide whether it was safe enough to go or not, and I had tried to talk to some family members who were working, and they were like, "We can't talk to you about this because is we can't be seen as working with the government, having anything formally to do with this, because it's a very delicate situation. So they put me in contact with some people who had worked in the government, but were now running NGOs. And that's where I started getting involved with a lot of the veteran founded groups. Mountain Seed Foundation was one of the main ones that I've been involved with since day one of the war. Their founder and chairman, Nathan Schmidt, he was a retired Marine lieutenant colonel who had served multiple combat tours in Iraq. He and his wife had gone on to become foreign service officers and working at the embassy in Kiev, and so they had lots of contacts. They had their NGO had boots on the ground in Ukraine. He's like, and he was basically told me, he's like, no, you really shouldn't go to Ukraine right now. It's not safe. He's like, but we have people that can help you out, in making sure that this chain of custody stuff is taken care of. And so it was just a serendipity. And so I started getting really involved with that group. Actually, some of the cool, I would call it the cooler, or just, things that have come out of the work that I've done. I mean, like I said, 3 years ago, if you had told me that my wife would have been the personal translator for Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes, and my daughter would have helped lead Scott Pelley down from the fourth tallest mountain in Austria as a part of the 60 Minutes piece that was done on Mountain Seed Foundation, I would have said, you're crazy. If you had told me I'd been part of helping, work on to get a documentary that made the Oscar shortlist with Max Lowe, I would have said you're crazy. But yeah, we've like Mountain Seed Foundation. You look up their stuff. They had a really top notch a documentary called Camp Courage on Netflix. They had one of the most watched pieces on 60 Minutes, and their work is focused on mental health, but it's as things have evolved over the course of the past 3 years. I started out medical material aid, just get as much in, but we've over time pivoted more to out of the sort of like emergency, just disaster relief, into what can we do to make sure that as in the healthcare space, we're doing the most to support Ukraine. And so I divide that work out into areas we work on, looking at trauma and acute care for front lines, and for making sure that the hospitals in Ukraine are receiving the best training and the best resources that are available to provide trauma and acute care. Ukraine is going to be one of the largest per capita veteran populations and amputee populations in the world. So we work on supporting rehabilitation and prosthetics programs. You have, in addition to the physical trauma, the mental trauma, which is enormous. So we've focused a lot on mental health programs, and like Mountain Seed Foundation was a group that I got involved with that was very focused on that, and we're now building that across all of the NGOs that I work with. And so I started with Umana and Rotary, got involved with Mountain Seed Foundation, another NGO that was really talented at getting material aid, but also had programs in these other areas of mental health programming and rehab and other support, was based in Milwaukee, a group called Friends of Being Angel. Their original organization was a German organization called Be an Angel that had been founded by a gentleman, Andreas Tolke, who was Germany's Person of the Year for his work in Ukraine. But before that, he had received their highest merit medal that a civilian could receive for his work that he'd done in, of all places, Syria. And that then became a huge part of the work we're doing. Another group, a veteran group, that I was introduced to from my friend Nathan Schmidt, the head of the Von Sieb Foundation. It was a group called Give to the World. Their founder is a U.S. Marine who his resume is just amazing. My friend David, he's a Naval Academy lecturer. He's a part of helping run U.S. security programs, but he had founded a charity 15, 16 years ago when he was first serving in Afghanistan to provide aid. And that's another group that just expanded our repertoire. It got us in contact with suppliers that Give to the World had worked with in other conflict zones. And the reason why I was introduced to David was David wanted to get involved in Ukraine, but they hadn't had experience. So my friend Nathan, who had been helping us from day one, said, well, let me introduce you to Doug. And then we started with just a small $50,000 shipment coming from Amsterdam that snowballed into us getting about somewhere in the we roughly estimate the number of shipments worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million worth of in-kind donations coming from warehouses in Amsterdam direct and in Europe directly into Ukraine. I wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't already had this pre-existing, like I call it our web of in-shows. And each one of them has this niche talent or expertise. And at the same time as I'm doing that, I'm getting involved with groups that are actually boots on the ground in Ukraine, providing direct medical services and or training. So I've been one of the main groups we do that with is Med Global. And here's another one of these interesting, strange web of connections. The founder of Med Global is Dr. Zahar Salul. Zahar Salul was a medical school classmate of Bashar al-Assad, the president.
This is wild. The small world,
and his wife is actually a cousin, or somehow distantly related, or somehow related to Bashar al-Assad's wife. So it's this bizarre connection of things, but through all of them, we're now working, across the spectrum to hit all of those really major healthcare space needs. So material aid, but supporting acute care needs, training, support front lines and in major hospitals throughout Ukraine where they're receiving the most casualties, but then supporting prosthetic rehab programs, supporting mental health programs, and then bridging beyond that, we do a lot of work for obviously advocacy and making sure that people actually really understand what's going on in Ukraine and sort of trying to dispel a lot of the misinformation that's out there. So we've done, as I mentioned, some of these pieces like I look at like the pieces that were done by the Von Sieb Foundation, the Camp Courage, which is and the 60 Minutes piece, as these are pieces to show the real stories of Ukraine. Because you look at most of the stuff that's out there, and it's all the disaster of the war, which unfortunately people get really kind of like desensitized to. People don't want to keep looking at how terrible and horrible the war is. Well, we try to produce pieces and tell stories about that even in the midst of war, there's actually some really just amazing stories coming out of Ukraine that highlight just how amazing and resilient the country and its people are, how any ideas that people have that it's still a backwards, corrupt Soviet country are just really not correct. I mean, if the country's not perfect, but then again, who are we to point fingers? I commonly like to say that, what they call corruption in Ukraine, here in the United States, we just call it capitalism.
That is true, and Dr. Davis, this is you make such a good point, and it's like I've actually made this exact point as well that Americans, when we've seen this happen unfortunately with like Africa a lot over the past 20 years of like, oh, what can I do? It's always been bad, it'll always be bad. Let's just give up, right? And fighting against that in Ukraine, saying this is a war that can be won. This is a war that should be, I don't know if should be, has to be fought.
Has to be. Yeah.
It has to be fought, and it needs to be won, and that this isn't just a corrupt, broken, post-Soviet country. It's an independent country with independent culture and a people that are fighting for the exact same belief systems that America was founded on hundreds of years ago. Yep. So as we kind of wind down today, Dr. Davis, both having military experience, being surrounded by that, being a Red Dawn expert and all these other different, things as well. What is your hope for the future of the American-Ukrainian relationship?
Well, my hope is that I actually like to say my job in all of this is to break the spell. And this, when I say that, I mean everything that I'm doing. I'm sure. I'm trying to be a medical humanitarian and provide as much aid and support to Ukraine as possible in this terrible crisis. But really, one of my main jobs is actually to convince the world and Americans and I don't care what your politics are, because it affects all of us, to get past our hyper-partisanship and to break this spell that people don't seem to understand, that this war with Russia, you can't avoid it. It's been unavoidable. And like it makes me laugh when people say they're trying to stop World War III from happening. It's like, you can't stop World War III from happening. It began in 2013. And part of the reason why we are so hyper-partisan and are so divided and have that feeling, like you just said, it's the world's too complicated, and you want to throw up your hands. That's not accidental, and it's actually, I like to tell people, if you want
strategy,
if you want to understand how we got to where we are today, and you want to understand where we're going in the future, you need to understand three people, and it's Yuri Bezmenov, Vladislav Surkov, and Alexander Dugin, and these are. Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB defector from the Soviet Union in the 70s. And he basically told us exactly what the Russians' active measures would be, or what the Soviet Union's active measures would be against the United States. He laid it out. And it was basically to exploit our open, free, liberal, democratic systems to weaponize them against ourselves, to make us, not see the enemy without, and to focus only on each other and the enemy within.
Yeah.
And so that was during the Soviet era. We convinced ourselves that we won the Cold War and that it was the end of history, like by Francis Fukuyama. All that happened was the 90s. Russia had to go through a reshaping from a communist Soviet system into its existing, mafia, oligarchic state, where Putin rose to the top. And then that's why this guy Surkov and Dugin are so important, because Surkov is the man that took what Yuri Bezmenov had laid out about Russian active measures against it, and he brought it into the 21st century under Putin. And the whole concept of nonlinear warfare, hybrid warfare, using quote-unquote reflexive control against the West, which is basically that New York Times article that I mentioned, A Plea for Caution by Vladimir Putin. It's one of the most exquisite examples of reflexive control and that I've ever seen. And you have so-called Russia experts in the United States who don't even know what the term reflexive control means. It's like what Russia does is not propaganda. It is reflexive control. It's much more I would say complicated, but it's much more insidious and it's much more profound than what mere propaganda. Propaganda is a part of reflexive control. So that was this guy Surkov, and then you have Alexander Dugin, and then you need to understand Alexander Dugin to understand Vladimir Putin's mentality. That conflict with the West, it's eschatological. It's in Vladimir Putin's mind, there's no way possible to not have conflict with the West, because his Russian imperialist designs. It's because Dugin is associated with a concept called Eurasianism, Russocentric Eurasian, which is basically, you translate that simply, it's the new Russian Empire. And if you understand those three people, then the spell can be broken, and you can understand that most of like the conflicts that we go on squabbling about here at home in the United States, a lot of it's been manipulated by Russians over the last 70 years, and it's gone into overdrive in the past 20. So,
yeah, and Dr. Davis, you make a lot of fantastic points, stuff that I've talked to, with my own colleagues and my own circles as well, that like a lot of Americans think Russia is this beacon of like traditional conservative values. Like that is the sales pitch. I'm not saying that is the truth, but that is often the sales pitch. But the reality is, and I would argue this has been the entire time of the Cold War, whether it was the civil rights movement, 9/11, everything else, every single time there is an opportunity to exploit division in the U.S., Russia has a vested interest in that. And we do have to wrap up here shortly. But every single time that division happens, there's an opportunity there. I think long ago, Russia realized they're not going to be able to defeat the West militarily.
Absolutely.
Nor do they have an interest in it as well. We're seeing how they're handling, outdated 90s tech in Ukraine right now, and nearly 700,000 casualties later. There's no reality where they want any piece of what a modern conventional war would look like. But nothing is stronger than a united America. Mm-hmm. I would say united America and a united political will in America is the most powerful tool we have in our arsenal. It's more powerful than our nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And here's, you can break it down very simply on one example, the 2016 election. So you talk to Democrats, they, unequivocally, there was Russian collusion to get Trump elected. The reality is that's not what the Russians were interested in. The Russians, all they were really interested in, and they probably preferred Hillary Clinton because they probably saw Donald Trump as too much of an X factor, too unpredictable. Yeah. But all they really cared about was making sure that no matter who won, half of the country would call the election illegitimate. So if Hillary had won, you'd have every Trump supporter saying, "Oh, she only won because the FBI helped her out when she should be in jail because of her servers down in her New York home basement." And the scenario that did happen, Trump wins, and half the country said, "No, he only won because the Russians helped him to win." All the Russians cared about was that half of our country would call the election illegitimate, no matter who won. That was what they were thinking, and that exemplifies how they engage the West.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. It's if there's division, they're winning, and that's why it's always been so disappointing that Ukraine has become a partisan issue, because I think it's an American issue through and through. And so, Dr. Davis, we do have to wrap up here today, but any closing thoughts for us? This has been a great episode. You're doing fantastic work. Unbelievably excited to learn more about you in the future. I'm sure we will have you on again in the future for additional updates as well. Sure. But any closing thoughts for us today?
I'll just finish where we've been talking about here the past few minutes, is that I would hope that that the spell is broken. That we stop seeing each other in this country as the enemy. I work with so many people that are now clutching their pearls and wringing their hands because Donald Trump has been elected. Well, he's been elected. We have to let's get past it and move on. Quite frankly, if you're a supporter of Biden, you should actually do a real, analysis of how much he actually really did to support Ukraine, because Jake Sullivan is considered a villain by many Ukrainians because he's given them only the maximum of the minimum. He's letting them bleed out. And so some of the popular narratives that people have, for their tribe, whether you're a MAGA Republican or a hardcore progressive liberal, I'd pressure people to question their accepted narratives more, because the truth is actually sometimes a little bit more complicated and less satisfying than people might think for their tribe if they actually look a little more carefully, and if they look carefully with an eye to how people like Vladislav Zhirkov and through nonlinear warfare and reflexive control have conditioned us to see our people within our country as the enemy, to distract us from the true enemy, which is without. So
yeah. Dr. Davis, this has been a fantastic episode. I've learned so much. I'm sure we could keep going on for much longer. This has been great information. Thank you for the work that you're doing for Ukraine and Ukrainians at home and abroad. I know you're doing absolutely long-term work that will continue, to fight the next war that comes after this, which is, the healing, the national healing that must happen from a civilian, veteran, and everywhere in between level. So thank you so much. We hope you have a great day, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you so much. It's great being on, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Cleveland Ukraine podcast. I want to give a special thank you to the Ukrainian Museum Archives of Cleveland for providing the space to host our show. Please consider donating to the museum at www.umacleveland.org. The Cleveland Maidan Association works daily to provide life-saving medical aid to at-risk Ukrainian civilians, funding for prosthetics, refugee support, and more. To help continue Maidan's mission, I urge you to consider donating to the Cleveland Maidan Association at www.clevelandmaidan.info. The Cleveland Ukraine podcast is available on all major podcast streaming platforms, and follow us on social media to catch special guest updates, behind-the-scenes features, and more.